Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Being Accountable to Our Communities, What Are We Promising and How Are We Working Together? I'm joining today from the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And as settlers, we're so grateful for the opportunity to gather here. We are so committed to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. My name is Lisa Attygalle. I'm the Consulting Director of Community Engagement with the Harwood Institute, and it is my pleasure to introduce this discussion and our guest for today, Rich Harwood. Welcome, Rich.
Good to be with you, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
So I'll tell you a little bit more about Rich. After working on more than 20 political campaigns and 2 highly respected nonprofits, Rich Harwood set out to create something entirely different. He founded what is now known as the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation in 1988 when he was just 27 years old. Soon after that, he wrote the groundbreaking report, Citizen and Politics, A View from Main Street, which was the first US national study to uncover that Americans didn't actually feel apathetic about politics, but instead held a deep sense of anger and disconnection. So over the past 30 years, Rich has innovated and developed a new philosophy and practice around how communities can solve shared problems, how they can create a culture of shared responsibility and deepen people's civic faith. The Harwood practice of turning outward is very well known and has spread to all 50 US states and is being used in 40 countries across the world. Today, Rich is spreading a vision for what it takes to create communities, lives, and a country that reflects the best in us and the best of us. And in his newest book, Stepping Forward, which I have right here, is an Amazon bestseller. Rich provides a new and inspiring footprint to rediscover what we share in common and build upon it. So thanks so much for joining me, Rich.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Thanks, Lisa.
Before we get started, let's just have a quick look at who's in the room. We have 425 plus now, actually. The registrations have kept trickling in, joining us from Canada, the US, and also people from Australia, New Zealand, UK, Mexico, France, India, Germany, the Philippines, and South Africa. And we also have people representing different sectors. So people from the nonprofit or community sector, from education, foundations, government, health, and consulting. And so hello and welcome to all of you. I'm so excited to first have a discussion with Rich, but really want to turn to your questions. And so we encourage you throughout this whole time to type any questions you have into that Q&A box, and we'll be allowing lots of time for discussion. So Rich, I have your book right here, and I was filled with joy as I was reading it, to be honest. There's something around a really important process that every person needs to take in figuring out what kind of leader are they, who are they, and how are they showing up for their communities. And I just think this is so important right now, more than, I shouldn't say more than ever, because we've been, history is long, but right now it seems so very important for leaders to really be mindful about how they're showing up for communities, and that how they show up actually sets the path and the feeling, the vibe, sets the path for the work that will happen in communities. And so I'd like to start there. What do you mean when you talk about showing up? What does that say to you? And what do you mean when you say how we show up is important?
Yeah, I think it means a few things. One is, I think, there's a really interesting nexus point between who we are as individuals and the work that each of us do in our communities. And I think so often those things get separated, and we just put our professional hat on and rely on data, rely on systems analysis, rely on all sorts of things that in essence remove us from the very work that we need to do. So for me, showing up is first and foremost, have we stepped forward and made ourselves visible? Have we declared, in a sense, Lisa, that I'm here I am. I'm ready. I'm going to, in making ourselves visible, I'm going to lean into the challenges that I face, not step away from them, not obscure who I am, not obfuscate, not pretend. I'm going to actually lean in. I'm going to be awake. I'm going to be attuned. And I think that in order for us to meet communities where they are, in order for us to really address what matters to people, in order for us to engender what I believe is one of the most important things we can do, which is to engender a sense of belief in ourselves and in one another, and a sense of authentic hope that we can make tomorrow better than today, because that in the end is what I think makes us human, makes us alive, makes us part of something. In order to do that, we have to step forward. We have to be turned outward toward one another. We have to see and hear one another. And we have to lean in and be engaged and attuned to where we are. And I think too often, even when we say we're doing those things, unfortunately, we're not.
So for those who aren't familiar or haven't heard of your phrase turning outward, can you just give a quick summary of what that means?
Sure. I think we each face a fundamental choice in our lives about what direction we're going to face. And this isn't about techniques, though techniques are important. It's not about process, though process is important. It's about something more fundamental. It's about our mindset, our orientation, our posture, our disposition. And I think first and foremost, as people who are trying to work together, we have a choice. Will we be turned inward toward ourselves, toward our own organizations, toward our own metrics, toward our own organization's survival? Or will we be turned outward toward the community, where the community itself is the reference point for everything that we do? And again, we've done millions of dollars of research on this, and we all want to believe we're turned outward, and it sounds so obvious and so easy, except Lisa, as you know, and the folks who have tuned in today know, it's not as easy as it sounds, because there are so many forces and factors that mitigate against that. And so many things that tell us just to stay focused on ourselves, hunker down, meet your metrics, meet your fundraising goals. And before you know it, we're inward looking. And while we're working in the community, we're not working as part of the community. Mm-hmm. And so turning outward as an orientation is a first step in this work.
It's so interesting. You know, it's the things that are inward focused that tend to have deadlines. And so those deadlines I find, are often the things that drive. And it's only until we have civil society movements like we do right now with Black Lives Matter, where the deadlines are the community focus. And so it's just interesting to think about that.
And if I could just say real quickly, because sometimes people don't believe I believe in these things, which is, I believe in deadlines. I'm super impatient. I am fierce about whether or not our work creates impact. I am fierce about whether or not we're taking action as opposed to getting lost in activity. But toward what end are we trying to create impact? Toward what end are we trying to move things forward? And I think those are the questions we need to continually focus our work on and our efforts on. And as we make ourselves visible and show up, we need to be attuned to.
Mm-hmm. So what are the things, if our goal is to show up authentically, what are the things that you think get in the way of us doing that?
Well, as I mentioned, I think we are turned inward very often. I think we get lost in process and in systems analysis and in data in ways that in essence, unfortunately, we're going through the motions, or even if we're applying ourselves and really leaning in, that we're not really attuned to what's happening in the community. We believe that our comprehensive plans, we're working in Jackson, Mississippi right now. They have schools that are failing them. They have a great comprehensive plan called Better Together for Jackson. But the thing is that what is really required to show up in Jackson is not simply a plan. It's whether or not the folks in Jackson can build a stronger civic culture where they have productive norms of engagement, where they have a sense of common purpose and common cause, where they are truly seeing and hearing one another, about whether or not they are truly affording each and every individual in that community dignity, or whether or not they're just giving lip service to that. All of these things, I think, contribute to a failure to show up, and get in the way of showing up.
Mm-hmm. What do you think fear, like how does fear play into it? And, you know, putting yourself out there, being vulnerable. Tell me your thoughts on that.
I think fear is huge. I think we get anxious about the challenges that we face. We are sometimes fearful of ambiguity. We are fearful of uncertainty. We are fearful of the unknown. Unfortunately, increasingly today, as you started with what's going on in so many of our countries, we are fearful of one another. Look, if we're going to battle systemic racism, whether it's in Canada, the US, Australia, or wherever, I know some folks from Afghanistan are on right now, we're going to have to deal with the fear of one another, of the beliefs we hold about one another, about the stereotypes we continue to that continue to persist in our minds about one another, about the biases we have. These are all rooted in fear. Mm-hmm. And we're going to have the courage and the humility to step forward and make ourselves visible, to stand in spaces with one another, to have the hard conversations we need to have. And then, if I can just mention one other quick thing, I think we have a fear at times of putting a stake in the ground and really articulating and saying, look, this is what I'm for. And I understand that in putting that stake in the ground, I can't be all things to all people. That in putting the stake in the ground, that I'm gonna annoy some people. Some people are gonna they're gonna get pissed off at me. They're gonna complain about what we're doing. And what I would say to the folks who are tuned in today is, if you really want to create change, if you really want to create impact, if you are really committed to being an agent for hope, then we have no choice than to overcome our fears and put a stake in the ground and say, we can't be all things to all people, because when we are nothing to anyone.
Mm-hmm. That's really powerful. I think, you know, as I think about community leaders wanting to listen to the community, I think sometimes there's a tension between not wanting to speak for the community, and when they're putting this stake in the ground, when might that be imposing, and when is it needed? You know, and I think that's a tension that feels very real.
Yeah, and it's another fear, and it's another thing that mitigates against turning outward. So what we know from our work, and I suspect this may be true for Tamarak's work and the partners you work with, is that this fear of not knowing what to do paralyzes us. Mm. And it places us over and over again in a planning loop where we just keep thinking, well, if we just create another plan to how to do this, somehow things will turn out better. And what I say to folks, one of the mantras that we teach people in our work is get in motion. The more in motion you are, the more possibilities you'll discover, the more serendipity that will occur, the more good things that can happen. Now, that requires that you have to be attuned and visible and awake, which requires that you have to listen. And so what I say to folks is, you can't speak for the community. Your job is to have a deep understanding of what matters to people in the community. And then there are certain tests. Do you have a clear understanding of who makes up this community? Not just the demographics, but the different voices and different perspectives, the different lived experiences. When you engage people, are you really willing to engage people who are different from yourself? These are all really basic things, but they go to the fears that you asked me about, because we tend to go to people who look like us, who sound like us, who do the same types of things that we do. We go to the neighborhoods that we're comfortable in because we know what to wear, what to say, how to engage with one another. When we listen to folks, we tend to believe we know what they're saying, so we take shortcuts in listening and make all sorts of assumptions about what they're saying and what they mean, when in fact we have very little idea about that. And so if we can open ourselves up to truly listen, if we can open our hearts up to truly engage with one another, if we can have a posture of curiosity in this engagement and of learning, then we can understand the patterns that exist in our community, and we can have much greater confidence in our capability to move forward with what we've learned. Last thing I'll say, we teach this test to folks in communities. Now, this is not an analytic test. This is a gut test. And we have all sorts of analytic tests about listening, but this is a gut test, which is in your community, if I brought after you listened, if I brought 300 people from across your community together into a room, and you had to reflect back to them, not your budget, not your comprehensive plan, not how many staff people you have, not how many volunteers, but you had to reflect back to them their aspirations, their shared aspirations for their community. If you had to reflect back to them their concerns that keep them awake at night, if you had to reflect back to them who they trust to take action in their community, if you had to reflect back to them all these things and some others in the language they speak, not in your own professional language, could you do it and would they believe you? And there's nothing like that gut check. I don't know about you, Lisa, but I've had to do this so many times now in my career, and I know when I don't know, and I know it, and I know when I'm trying to pretend I know. I think we all know that. This is part of showing up.
Yeah.
We also know when we have a deep confidence, even if people may disagree with us, because we've learned so deeply, we have such a deep knowledge that we're confident. And that's really critical to the work that we're all doing.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind as you speak is humility. You need to have that humility. And I think there's also different cultures around permission to fail or permission to get it wrong. Yeah. We talk a lot about learning as you go. Whenever you're working on anything that's complex, there is no such thing as a plan, and you have to learn as you go. And I think that requires different ways of showing up. Showing up and saying, I don't know, but let's learn together.
Absolutely. And it goes back to, so let me just pick up your theme of humility and what I was talking about in terms of putting a stake in the ground. I think in order to put a stake in the ground, you have to have the courage to listen. You have to have the courage to make discernments. You have to have the courage to try to figure out what really matters. And then you have to have the courage to step forward and say, this is what we're for. But that courage by itself is always inadequate. It leads to hubris and arrogance, a beating of the breast that somehow I know best. And if I just plow ahead, everything's going to be all right. So what I'd like to say is that courage without humility is not worth a whole lot. And we have to have, as you suggest, the humility. How in God's name can we listen to other people without humility, without being open to what they have to say, without being willing to hear that they might have different perspectives than we do and then other people might? How could we know where to put the stake in the ground if we don't have the humility to recognize that we don't have all the answers and that we need each other, that we can't go it alone on our own? And then, as you said about recalibrating and learning all the time, in this work, what I've found is there will come a time, and there will always be a time at some point, where you have to pick up that stake that you put in the ground about what you're for, and you're going to have to move it. You're going to have to do it in public, and you should do it in public, which requires enormous humility to say, you know what? Either I didn't understand something before that I now do understand, or that the conditions around me have changed, or that the things that we thought would work simply aren't working. And I'm here to say I'm picking up my stake and I'm going to move it as best I can to a new place based on what I've learned, what I know, what I've engaged with other folks around. That requires real humility. And it requires humility to explain it and explain yourself, to be real about it, to be authentic and honest about it. And there's far too short a supply of that kind of humility in our society right now.
So what does it mean to you, Rich, to be accountable to the community?
It's interesting, Lisa. First of all, so at one level, I know many of the people who are listening today and the folks we work with use metrics. I'm a big believer in metrics. We want to know if what we're doing is effective. So that's one form of what it means to be accountable. But I think there's a deeper form that actually I spend more of my time talking about. And so I don't even use the word, we use the word accountable, but actually the word I really like is, what does it mean to account for oneself? To account, to take account, right? And so in that sense, you have to show up again. So in this way, for me, being accountable to the community, to account for oneself means, do you really have a deep understanding? Do you have an understanding of what matters to people? Do you have an understanding of the context you're working in? We have a framework called the 5 stages of community life. Every community is in one of them.
I used it last week.
Oh, great. Thank you. Most of our comprehensive strategies are geared to the 4th or 5th stage. Most communities that I've been in most countries are in the first 2.5 stages. Have we accounted for that context and meeting the community where it is as opposed to where we wish the community were? Accounting for ourselves even more deeply means that, are we accounting for the pledges and promises that we've made to the community and to ourselves? You know, all of us make all sorts of pledges and promises, and we tend to do it on glossy paper in 4-color print. It's saddle stitch reports. It looks real nice. But at the end of the day, what I ask people is, look, go into a room and close your eyes, or go and shut off the light, and just sit there and think, can you account for the pledges and promises that you've made? Because so often we are making pledges and promises we know we can't hit and we ought not to make in the first place. And here's the thing, Lisa. I happen to think that while there are many issues that we all care about and are really important in our societies today, that the most important central issue in most places today is, do we believe in ourselves and in one another that we can come together and get things done? Or are we going to go it alone on our own, divided in acrimonious ways, pointing fingers at each other, blaming each other for things, just announcing our grievances to one another? Or are we going to come together and actually believe? And if you believe that that's a critical issue, then what helps establish belief? It's making good on our pledges and promises. It's not making the pledges and promises, it's making good on them. And so we damn better make sure that we're making pledges and promises we can keep, and we damn better make sure that we're accounting for whether or not we're doing it, and we damn better make sure that we're recalibrating our efforts when we're not.
So that makes me think that the importance of I'm coming back to, what is the role of hope? And part of me feels a little bit fearful when you talk about, we better not make promises that we can't keep, like, of course, but maybe that will make me claw back, and not actually want to vision, not actually want to, commit to something that might not be possible.
Well, look, yeah, absolutely. Here's how I think about it. Look, I started this institute. I didn't have a dime to my name. I was 27 years old. Every mentor, every individual, my parents pleaded with me not to do this. And so I had an idea, I had a vision, I had a dream. And so I laid that out. And much like we all want to do in our community. So I'm not saying to folks in communities, don't have a bold vision. In fact, I am saying, put a stake in the ground about what you believe in. But let's be clear about where we're starting from. Let's be clear about the progress we think we can make in a certain amount of time. Let's be clear about what real measurements are to know whether or not we made that progress in the set time that we said we're going to work in. Let's be clear about how we're going to continue to learn as we go, so we can continue to recalibrate what we're doing, so we can get closer to creating authentic hope. These are all real practices we can practice, we can do. This isn't theory. I don't care about theory. These aren't concepts. Honestly, I like ideas, but I'm most interested in what works. And so if you're interested in hope and you want to create a bold vision, then let's get practical about what it's going to take to get there. And let's be real about what those steps are. And then let's account for what we said we were going to do and recalibrate as we go.
Mm-hmm. And you use the terms utopian vision versus practical hope. And I'm wondering, can you share a bit of a story about how you've seen that play out and balancing the, utopian hope versus the practical vision?
Sure. I mean, we were working in Mobile, Alabama, and they hadn't passed the school levy in 40 years. And the utopian vision was somehow, just by doing a public relations campaign or getting the business community around the table or spending more money on their schools, or shaming public officials into something that somehow they were going to create these utopian schools. Never happened and didn't happen for 40 years. The practical hope they created was when a really courageous leader there named Carolyn Akers with the Mobile Area Education Foundation began, they ended up using our work, but they could have used your work or someone else's work. That's immaterial. They started to engage people around their shared aspirations and demonstrated that the community was not as divided by race and income and urban versus rural versus suburban as everyone said it was and was part of the ingrained narrative of that community. They demonstrated that people shared aspirations about how they wanted to move forward. They began to lay out plans, practical plans about how they could take one step after another, over a decade, and then 15 years, to create progress. They held the school board accountable along the way. They held themselves accountable along the way. They recalibrated their efforts along the way. So it was a grind. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There were times when it looked like it was going to fall apart, for sure, like it does on all of us. But they were able to do it. Now, they've passed every school levy since the time that they hadn't passed one in 40 years. They went from some of the lowest performing schools to some of the best performing schools in the state of Alabama. They have young girls learning STEM, which before they were sort of railroaded out of those classes. They have begun to close the achievement gap. They have a more equitable distribution of teachers across rural and urban and suburban schools. So it can be done, but they had to get practical about it. They had to get real about it while creating a sense of hope all along the way that they had the innate capacities, the will, the know-how to get stuff done.
Mm-hmm. It feels like a bit of a formula for building and sustaining momentum.
It is. And, what I often say to people is, and particularly now, if you look at systemic racism, if you look at First Nation issues that have plagued Canada for generations, that, we have Native American issues here that have the part of the original sin of our nation, along with slavery. The challenges that so many of our communities face, I don't believe that most citizens in our communities believe that we're going to fix these problems overnight or tomorrow or even in 5 years. I've never met people who believe that, really. Here's what they want to see, which goes to momentum. They want to see that we can get on a better trajectory that's moving in a right direction, that's filled with a sense of possibility and hope. They want to know that our efforts on this trajectory are gaining momentum, not losing momentum, which most efforts in communities do, unfortunately. And third, they want to know that our civic confidence, our belief in ourselves and one another, is expanding, not contracting. And I believe that those organizations, those leaders, those collaborations, those collective impact initiatives that are able to get on a better trajectory with increasing momentum and growing civic confidence, they're the ones who are going to win. And those are the communities that are going to improve. And we need more examples of this across our countries.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, and it's something that I've seen, come up so much with COVID, and then, we're able to find a place for it with Black Lives Matter, is that role of the citizen.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of caremongering groups up here in Canada, where people who might before have stepped back and seen, it's somebody else's responsibility to do that thing or to, provide those services, they stepped up. It was such a great example of people stepping forward into that citizen role.
Yeah. And
I just think that gives me a lot of hope, seeing people enter into that citizen role, as we see the decline of democracy, what are the things that are going to change that? And it's people stepping into that citizen role, which I think plays a big part.
Absolutely. This is part of what it means to turn outward. Mm-hmm. I believe when we turn inward, we think primarily about our own institutional role and oftentimes other large institutions that are our peers in the work that we're doing or other groups in our network. I think when we turn outward, we begin to recognize and value the human spark, that there are innate capacities in every individual, no matter their station in life, And it's not just in individuals, though that's important. It's in different organizations. It's in small nonprofits. It's in faith institutions. It's in arts groups. And that, one of the things I like to talk about is that we need to somehow find ways to combine the institutional actions with human scale actions so that we can fully marshal the collective resources of our communities, which requires us deeply to believe in the innate capacities of different groups, of different, as you said, of different citizens and different people, that we all have something to contribute, no matter how small. And it's all valuable because what it does is it reflects that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that we have a stake in something, that we believe in each other, that we're willing to lean in and make ourselves visible. And yes, that's important to solving problems, but it's even more important to the health and vibrancy of democratic societies and to the health and vibrancy of our community life.
Mm-hmm. And you use the words personal responsibility versus shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Talk more about that and how you see the differences and the like, what is that responsibility that each of us have?
I think we hopefully feel a sense of responsibility toward one another, that we make ourselves visible, that we don't turn our backs on one another, that where we believe we can contribute, we contribute, that we see ourselves fundamentally as citizens and co-producers and co-creators of our communities, not as claimants and consumers and complainers in our communities. So as in terms of personal responsibility, I think there's that. Another way of saying that is we each have to show up in our own ways. I think shared responsibility is, what I'm really concerned about is how do we build the civic culture within our communities where we can combine these institutional actions with human scale actions and do it in a way that we're not only, as I said before, solving problems, which is important and critical to all of our work, but that we are shifting the ways in which we relate to one another. We're fundamentally shifting the ways in which we see one another. We're shifting the ways in which we work together. We're shifting the ways in which we learn together. In other words, we're shifting the ways in which we imagine and create and co-create our civic culture in which we live together and make our lives together. And I think that requires not just mechanistic responses, though sometimes it does. Sometimes it requires technocratic responses, but fundamentally it requires something. Those are all necessary, but they're not sufficient. We need something bigger and something that I think gets closer to something what I would call shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm. I love that, and I was writing down institutional actions plus human scale actions. Mm-hmm. I think that's so important, and just understanding those two. We might play both of those roles. We mm-hmm. might represent an organization. Lately, I've been doing a lot of research and writing about what exactly does it mean to be community-led. Mm-hmm. As we see the calls for community-led approaches, what exactly does that mean? And I think it's that the combination between leveraging both those institutional actions and the human scale actions that really starts to get at where that can be really powerful.
Absolutely, and it gets back to where you began, which is what does it really mean to listen and to deeply know your community, and then to, as you're suggesting now, believe in distributed capacities for us to take action that no one organization, no one coalition, no one individual, no one leader has the capacity to create change. I know we all know this, but I'll just say, we just did a study, actually, we called it our 30-year impact study, and then the name of it is called Planned Serendipity, about how do you plan for serendipity in communities, and so we looked at our initiatives over 30 years to see what we could learn again from them, and we're about to publish it as a book. But the point I want to make is, communities don't change as communities. Communities change through networks of people and groups and ways of doing things. And so for most communities, that requires we need multiple networks. we need multiple groups, right? So there is no one of us who can do this on our own, and there is no single plan, I don't believe, that can help regenerate or improve or strengthen a community. We need to come at this from multiple angles, with multiple actors, with multiple actions, and create the kind of combustion that creates innovation and ideas and learning and competition of ideas, which I think is equally important as we do our work. Which, if I can just say one last thing about this, that's part of the thing about showing up. When we show up, we want everything neat and tidy. What I'm arguing for is when we show up, we want, messiness is part of what we're all up to. The competition of ideas is really healthy for us. Being challenged is really great, it's healthy for us. Seeing what works and what doesn't work is really healthy for us. So when we show up, we have to show up ready to engage in these ways, so that we can make things, we can actually create something better than what we have now.
Thank you so much, Rich. This has been such a wonderful discussion, and I want to allow time for questions. And so just a reminder to everybody to please, you can add your questions to the Q&A box on your Zoom client. And Duncan, can you help take us through some of the questions that we have so far?
Yeah, thank you both. Lots of questions coming in so far. And again, even if you don't have a question, you can open up the Q&A panel and use the thumbs up button to vote on which questions you'd like to see answered. The first question comes from Joe, and they ask, does this sort of change have to start with a public leader who gets it, or can citizens or other local organizations initiate these types of changes?
Great question, Joe. Actually, most of the change that I've seen in my work over 30 years now typically has not come from a public leader, which is not to say that it couldn't, but it hasn't. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. In the States, what I can say is that it hasn't, because I think our public leaders have been, by and large, the last ones to hop on the train in terms of changing the civic culture of our community. That's not true for every public leader, but that's definitely been true by and large. So the change I've seen in Mobile was started by a group of citizens who formed this organization called Mobile Area Education Foundation, and they went to work and started to enlist different groups. In Battle Creek, Michigan, where we did work, which went over 6 or 8 years, it began by 6 individuals who formed an ad hoc group, all came from organizations, but came from formed an ad hoc group. They thought they were going to create a new program, a new 501c3 nonprofit, go to a foundation to get funding for it. And what they realized was their greatest role in the community was to gain a deeper understanding of the community and to be a connector and catalyst, and never name themselves, never have a piece of stationery, never have an office, just stay as an ad hoc group and just keep it growing. In other places, I've seen it begun by a local community foundation or local foundation, which was the convener. So in Mississippi, where we're starting in Jackson in a couple of weeks, it's the Community Foundation for Mississippi, but the actor is not going to be the Community Foundation. The actor is going to be various groups within the community that are sparking this change. Because in Jackson, what needs to be demonstrated is that change can get started. It can get started by different types of people from different parts of the community. And to Lisa's point, that it can be maintained, the momentum can be maintained over time, because they have a history of starting and stopping things there. So one of the findings, or insights from this 30-year impact study is we said it doesn't matter who starts the change. Now, it actually does matter in terms of their practices and everything, but really what that means is when we look across all these initiatives, we're finding different actors in each place starting it and being the spark plug and helping to catalyze it. What they shared in common with certain characteristics, not who they were.
It makes me, I think that's so important. And it makes me think, I was part of a session recently about how to enable change in the climate justice space. And one of the calls from the city councillors, there was a municipal panel, and a huge call that came out of it was we need to hear from community members what's most important to you. You know, if it's the leader, you know, coming forth and saying this is important, that's actually not as respectful or representative than that coming from the community. And so I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully if the leader does do that, you know, obviously there's a role for leadership, and, you know, but what I would say in most cases is, and there's a role for risk taking, which I think is part of this, which we haven't talked about, but, you know, on all the education issues we've worked on in different places where school superintendents or mayors have tried to step forward without really the public, without really understanding what really matters to people, and understanding the level of public will, and understanding the stage of community life, for instance, that the community is starting in, those efforts have failed by and large. And so what I would say to leaders who want to engage in the heroic leadership mode, where they're going to ride in on the white horse and pretend somehow they have all the answers and they're God's gift to the world. Do it at your own peril. God bless you. I don't expect to see you very long.
That's fantastic. Thank you both for that. Our next question comes from Jeff. How do we motivate people inside our organization to turn outward and engage community authentically? And how do we create an engagement-capable culture inside of an organization that values and welcomes the involvement of community in the organization's work?
Yeah, so this is actually part of the work of the Institute. So if you're willing to stay on for the next couple of hours, I'm happy. No, let me just tell you where I think you need to start. And we discovered this really through failure, honestly. So this is not like somehow we made this up. We discovered this because we out of necessity. I think the place to start is to ask the folks in your organization, what are their aspirations for the community? And what are their aspirations for their organization in relationship to that? And what are the challenges that are holding the community back, and what are the things that need to change in order to make progress? What I know about most people, 90% I want to say, who work in public libraries, who work in nonprofits, who work in faith institutions, who work in art organizations, who work in even foundations sometimes, is they went into these areas because they cared about something. They had, if you want to call it, I'll call it a calling. There's something noble about why they wanted to do this work. They could have done something else. They probably could have made more money someplace else. They could have had an easier life someplace else. We all know this. And yet, when we turn inward, our own aspirations, our shared aspirations get caked over. They get pushed aside. We tell our staff folks and our colleagues in our organizations, you know, don't look up too much, just get your work done. Don't worry too much about what's going on in the community, just get your work done. Don't worry too much about whether or not we're really focused on what matters to people, though we wouldn't say it that way. But we do say just focus on the metrics, and we do it at the expense of what matters to people. Don't worry about whether or not our programs are really effective, just raise more money. And so if in fact we want to create a culture where people really do care about the community, where they have affection, where they can act on their affection for the community, which is already within them, where they can be motivated to be part of your mission, then we have to help them reclaim and rediscover, sometimes reignite those aspirations they hold. And then we as leaders need to make damn sure that we're creating a culture that is focused on being turned outward and what matters to the community and how our mission relates to that, and not become so fixated on these internal things that take us farther and farther away from those. Which is not to say, because I have to do this every day too, I have to worry about metrics, I have to raise money every day, right? I have to make sure our organization functions well every day. But it's in the context of being turned outward and our mission, not off by itself.
Yeah, thank you for that. I, in my work, had been collecting and asking communities what's holding you back from authentic engagement. And it culminated in writing a paper, I think just in November, on creating the culture for engagement. And it looks at the common barriers that I had heard from community organizations or municipalities around engaging authentically. And then I've shared strategies for each of those on how they might be able to move forward. And so we've just shared the link for that in the chat box.
So you shouldn't have even asked me the question. We should have just gone directly to the link.
No.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you both for that. Our next question comes from Harrison, and they ask, how can focusing on self-help or self help us move beyond the top-down imposition of requirements, such as from government and institutional requirements, towards the bottom-up question, how can I help you?
Great question. I think of this in terms of, if I interpret your question one way, I think of this in terms of what's your sphere of influence? I work with a lot of leaders, we're working in Hawaii with education leaders who keep telling me that there's a compliance culture and we're trying to help them shift from being the chief compliance officer to the chief innovation officer. And I say this to people who work in public libraries, wherever you may be. There are going to be institutional requirements. There are going to be constraints on us. There are going to be funding constraints on us. Those are all realities. We can't get rid of them. Unfortunately, we have to learn how to work with them. And so one thing I think we need to figure out is how do we leverage those to help us achieve our mission? So that's one thing. The second is in terms of focusing on self, which I think was part of your question. I would ask you, so where is your sphere of influence? Where can you act? Where can you begin to make a difference? Lisa was just talking about this paper that she wrote on the culture of engagement. If you're going to create that culture in an institution that doesn't hold those beliefs or desires, you still have a sphere of influence. Who can you work with laterally in your organization? Who can you work with right above you? Who can you work with diagonally? There's always people you can work with. Who can you start to partner with out in your community? And how can you begin to activate and fulfill your sphere of influence and build more and more allies over time so that this can spread? And so I never believe, or seldom believe, that we are without options. What I do believe is that we've got to be really strategic about, and what I would use the word ruthless, which some people don't like, but I use it just for effect, really, because I think we have to get real about where can we begin to create change and impact and begin to make a difference so that we don't find ourselves sitting around a conference room bemoaning all the things that can happen, when in fact there are things that still can happen. And for my bets and for where I am, I want to focus on what can happen.
I think a lot of times, the question around how I can help often, is connected to fear, because what if you can't help? And what if it's not within your jurisdiction or within your mandate? And so I just think, I think that needs to go away for one. But I think I've heard, the term relationship broker, and we all see it as our responsibility, even if we can't help, who can help? And one of those spheres of influence is our networks. And so how can we actually be an aid to the community because we have influence?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're facing here in the States the crystallization of 401 years of history of systemic racism and injustice. I'm a white man over 50. And so there are questions about what are my legitimate spheres of influence? What can I speak out on, and what ought I step to the side and let other people who are more qualified or who have different lived experiences speak to? Where do I have relationships and where don't I have relationships? And so what I simply said to my board the other day along these lines is, we will never pretend to have answers that we don't have. But we will always step forward and make ourselves visible and fight where we believe we have something to contribute. And so I think that's true for most issues. we may not be able to do everything we want to do. We can't fix all the problems of the world. We can't take on all the problems of the world. The question is, what is our contribution? And how do we account for ourselves in making that contribution?
Yeah, thank you both. We have time for one or two more questions. The next one comes from Nancy, and they ask, how do we sustain this work? We made such great progress, then new leadership focused elsewhere. How do we recover that lost ground?
Yeah, another great question and another universal challenge. You know, one is, I think, maintaining the networks that you have, I suspect you've built, and that those networks in and of themselves have power, have juice, have the ability for people to stand next to each other and support one another. So I would make sure to value those things and to see them and to grab hold of them and to continue to work with them. The other thing I would say, which is just part of the Institute's work, is we think of change as working in the sweet spot, which is, you know, the old Venn diagram in 8th grade math. I almost failed 8th grade math. Is the only thing I really remember. But in 8th grade math, there was a Venn diagram. If you think of the left-hand side is the issues, the particular issues that matter to people that you're trying to move the needle on, you know, make impact on, make a difference on. And if you think of the right-hand circle as the underlying conditions that create the civic culture of a community, which I think of as the enabling environment of a community, which actually is what creates the sustainability. We need to learn to work in more disciplined and explicit ways in the sweet spot of that Venn diagram, which means designing initiatives that not only make a difference on the issues we care about, but that actually help to construct and build the sustainable enabling environment that enables change to keep going over time, even when a leader begins to turn elsewhere. And in these communities that we looked at in our 30-year impact study, what we found was they were able to do that. So as leaders' agendas changed, as new mayors came and went, as new school superintendents came and went, as foundations came and went, the work went on. The work went on. And it was because, in part, they were able to work in this sweet spot, which means, A, we have to have a deep understanding of the community, and that understanding has to infuse our strategies. It means that our strategies have to be infused with understanding what this enabling environment is and how we create it. And then we actually have to implement those strategies in a way that actually makes this enabling environment real, as opposed to just focusing on the programs that we're implementing. You know, there's a discipline in all that. We can learn that discipline. I suspect many of you already have it. But we can learn it, we can do it, we can spread it. We know we can spread it. The Institute has spread it. Tamarack is spreading it in other ways. And I think it's part of our ticket forward to creating a more hopeful, resilient, equitable, and fair society.
I think a lot about the energy of the people doing the work, and I think energy plays a lot into how rapidly change happens or doesn't happen. You know, and I think there is something to be said for understanding, you know, what is important to people and what are they going to work their butts off on, you know, and what might be less important, you know, and it's still important, but the energy just isn't there right now. And so I just think that's in terms of sustaining momentum. I think it's really important to ask people, you know, where is their energy and what are they willing to work on?
Yeah, and this is why this trajectory is so important. Because if you can figure out what matters to people and where there's some energy and you can get things moving, it's why we keep saying to people, get in motion. Things create a momentum of their own. In Clark County, Kentucky, which is a rural community that had been stuck for decades, that we've been working with for a few years now, there is a momentum that's been created there now that I think is unstoppable. And it's because people started with things that mattered. They started small, they kept building new networks. And now there is no one organization, one institution, one leader who's orchestrating this. It's the collective of the community that's moving this forward.
Mm-hmm. We're almost at time, but I really would love, Rich, if you could just respond really quickly the next question we have is around showing up with messiness.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how communities can embrace that messiness?
Yeah. One is, I think, the better understanding you have of what matters to people, the more that becomes an anchor for you in your work, so that it becomes a touchstone. So you can always go back to that and remind yourself, this is what matters. This is our North Star. This is what we need to stay focused on. Second, I think, if you have working hypotheses about what you're trying to do, you can keep coming back within the messiness and begin to say, well, is this working or is it not working? Notwithstanding the messiness. Is it working or not working? And to your point, Lisa, from earlier, what am I learning along the way so that I can continually recalibrate? So you can either think of the messiness as an enemy, or you can embrace it as your friend, even though it's going to drive you a little crazy. You can embrace it as your friend because it's it's knowledge about the community, it's knowledge about what's happening, it's knowledge about who has energy to work with you and who doesn't have energy to work with you. And the way I think of this is how do you keep harvesting this knowledge to make better choices and more intentional judgments so that you can be more effective, more impactful, more significant, more relevant. And importantly, most importantly, that you can be an agent for hope.
Thank you so much, Rich. It's just been a pleasure talking to you for the last hour. Thank you to everybody who's joined us for all of your questions. I'm just going to hand to Duncan. He has a few announcements to share.
The first announcement is that through the month of July, the Harwood Institute is committed to bringing you free weekly community building webinars like this one to help equip you for community change. You can join us for discussions on systems change, community engagement, youth engagement, and much more. And if you can't join the live event, you can still register and receive a full recording of the call. In a few days, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the full recording of today's call, additional resources, as well as the learning opportunities I've just mentioned. And if you want to learn more, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks again, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.